Thank you very, very much. Pastor Elliot asked me to, this be the fourth one that I've done out of an entire series. If you want to watch the whole series, it's on our website, PrescottPottersHouse.com. But Pastor Elliot has asked me to do the series that relate to Australia. And so this is actually the final lesson in the series and kind of brings us up to date. Joshua chapter 4. These are memorial stones. I'm telling stories about our fellowship, where we came from, how we got where we are, and lessons we learned along the way. So if I have a reader, I'm going to read Joshua 4 through 7.
Then Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the children of Israel, one man from every tribe. And Joshua said to them, "Cross over before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and each one of you take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel. That this may be a sign among you when your children ask in time to come, saying, 'What do these stones mean to you?' Then you shall answer them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be a memorial to the children of Israel forever."
Okay, let's talk about preparation for succession. A wise leader must prepare for the future, and every leader actually needs to prepare for the day when they are gone, whether that is in death or moving on in some ways. Years ago, they can put this on the screen. Years ago, I had someone ask me, what would I do one day when Pastor Mitchell is gone, my father, when he's gone and he has chosen a successor? And this was my reply: I will assume that just as my father heard from God and had great wisdom in everything else, that he heard from God and is showing wisdom in choosing a successor. At that time, in no way did I ever think that that would be me. Lisa and I went to South Africa in 1997. We left Australia. We were pastoring in Footscray, went to Johannesburg, South Africa. Pioneered, built a church, built a building, became the conference center for Southern Africa, planted churches. And so we were there. At the 7-year mark of being in South Africa, I began to feel restless, which I knew this was a sign from God. I was not dissatisfied. We loved South Africa, but I knew that our time there was done and God was preparing us to move on. We had no direction, no burden of where to go. I just knew that God wanted us to leave. We had been 7 years in South Africa. We had before that spent 2 years in Footscray here in Australia. So it had been 9 years since we had lived in America. And so in the absence of clear direction from God, we looked, where do we not have churches? And so we decided, unless God directs us otherwise, we will pioneer in Miami, Florida. That's what we had decided. One day I came home from prayer and Lisa came in and her eyes were wide. She said, "Greg, this morning I was praying and God spoke to me that we should go to Turkey." And I was like, clearly you ate too much pizza last night. That was not in any way on my radar. I wasn't thinking about Turkey. I thought, that's just weird. And another missionary, Robert Polacco, he asked me to go with him to a mechanic near my house. And so we went. The mechanic, he was a chain smoking, just a full sinner. And he heard our accents while he's looking at the car, asked us, why are we here in South Africa? We're pastors, we're preaching the gospel, coming to help people. And the man, he looked right at me and he said, "You need to go to Turkey." And Robert thought that was a great joke. Yeah, you need to go to Turkey. But he didn't know what Lisa had said. That freaked me out. I went home and told Lisa, and I said, "I'm going to call Dad. You know, we've been overseas for 9 years. What I thought Dad was going to say is, don't be stupid. You've been overseas for 9 years. It's time to come home." I told him, Lisa prayed, God said, the mechanic, the sinner, looked at me and said, "You need to go to Turkey." And Dad's response was, "Could be God. You should go check it out." I was like, no. That is not the answer that I was looking for. I had no burden. I like Turkish food, but I didn't want to go to Turkey. And so, but I had made a deal with God when I was a young disciple, is God, I will do anything you tell me to do. And I've followed that all through my salvation and ministry. And so I did. I booked a ticket to go scout the land in the nation of Turkey. And I want to tell you, I was struggling with this. I was not happy about it. And so I clearly remember British Airways flight. We are flying and sitting in my seat, it became an altar. I am talking to God. I'm mentally wrestling with this. God, I don't want to do this, but I surrendered on that plane. It became an altar. And I said, God, I don't want to go to Turkey, but if you want us to go, we will go. I surrendered. Went to several cities in Turkey, met people, scouted around. Near the end of the trip, I felt God speak to me, this is not for you. It's like, okay, good. We could have saved a lot of money if you told me that back in South Africa. And the real issue is it was a test. It's wonderful to talk about back when you were a new convert and how you would do the will of God when you're a new convert. I was no longer a new convert. God wants to know if your obedience is up to date. It was a test. And I thought, this is very, very strange. Weeks later, Dad came for a conference in South Africa, called me in the office one day, said he wanted to talk to me about the future. At that time, he said, I'm 75 years old. And he said, it's time to prepare for my succession. And I'm like, okay. And he told me he had been praying, seeking God. And he said, I want you to come to Prescott. I want you to succeed me as the leader of the fellowship. He explained apart from hearing from God, he explained his reasoning. I had wide experience. I've pioneered, taken churches. I've gone overseas as a missionary. I've evangelized. I've been an assistant. I've done basically everything you can do in ministry. But he felt fruitfulness, planting churches, but he felt missionary experience was very important for a leader. And then he told me a big part of that was my wife, Lisa. He said, Lisa would make an excellent leader's wife. Lisa doesn't fight with people. Lisa knows how to keep her mouth shut. We never have to clean up trouble that my wife has caused. And he said that is one of the reasons. And so I want to tell you, this caught me completely off guard. I was not expecting that. And I honestly, when he said it, I heard what he said, but I thought in my head, this will never happen. He had, if you listen to the memorial stones, several men that he left in Prescott didn't work out. They revealed their unhealthy character, so he had to change his mind already twice. And so I thought, what would happen? I'll come, and then he'll see one day, what was I thinking? I found somebody better. And so I said, look, Dad, okay, I can't see it, but I trust you. If you say so, I will agree and will come. But if you ever change your mind, no hard feelings. We'll do that. Lisa and I made a decision, and that is we're going to go to Prescott and we are going to serve my parents. And in their later years, and we're going to serve the Prescott Church, and that is what we do. The future will take care of itself. All we want to do is be a blessing to my parents. We served my mother. I helped her in any of the duties and issues of life until she passed away in 2016. Lisa and I served my father until his dying breath in 2020. And so my father prepared me in wisdom. Getting ready, it was not just one day, oh, by the way, I'm going to die, you're going to take over. Long in advance, he prepared me. That we went in 2004, and he began the process. He talked over decisions, crises that were going on. He would ask me what I thought because he wanted to know if I thought like him. That's very, very important. He told me things. He wanted me to know how he approached decisions, people, conflicts, how he treated people, He would test me by asking me these things of how I saw it to make sure that I was approaching and thinking like him. He involved me in conflict meetings. He involved me in international church planting meetings to get an understanding of that. I asked lots of questions. I wanted to know about the past. How do we get here? I wanted to know, why did you do that? Why did you not do this? I wanted to know his approach. What do you think about the future? I wanted to make sure that I had his spirit and I could think like him. And then my father began to give me exposure. Several years in, he began having me preach at night. Wednesday night of conference, I preached every conference. There were clearly other men that were more qualified and better preachers, but my father was sending a message. Many ways, the announcements. I began making the announcements because he was sending a message. He didn't want people to be surprised at the last second, like the reading of a will. He wanted them to be prepared for it. There are people, they ask me, I get asked questions when I travel by people that are inexperienced, like, you know, was it a shock when you were, as though it's like, like the reading of a will, like, what? I'm taking a, if you didn't know that I was taking over in later years, you probably didn't pay attention in school either. You missed stuff, but my father made it clear, and that was to help all of us. Let's talk about the Australian Rebellion. Here in Australia, in the Beachboro Church, and the man who was the pastor at that time, leader of all the Australian works, he began to shift the emphasis of the church. When Lisa and I left, it was evangelism, discipleship, calling, the will of God. He began to shift the emphasis subtly over time to money. The one time, many of you know that for many years, I don't know, 20 years, Lisa and I, we didn't exist. We were ghosts because we were never invited, never included. The one time I was invited to come and preach, we're riding along and he told me, you know, I'm basically a millionaire. Like, I didn't ask you, and I don't know if you know, but that's rude to tell someone your finance, but that's out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, right? People in the church, when we would come for a visit, we began to see that no longer the heartbeat of the church was souls and discipleship and world evangelism. When we talked to people, it was about investment properties and retirement. It was money. He proselyted a large number of people from other churches. Huge group, as you know, they came in. They were already Christians. And the numbers, it increased the numbers. It looked good on paper. The problem is when you bring in people, already existing Christians in, they didn't have our spirit. And that begins to affect the spirit of the church. He began to actively move on people to move here from fellowship churches. What happens? I get calls, every leader gets calls. They have a conflict with their pastor. The job of a leader is to try to get those people to resolve it with their pastor, stay in place where God saved him. During that era, that's not what happened. If anyone called with a problem with their pastor, in short order, he'd work on them and they'd wind up moving to Perth. Numbers are increasing, but this is, it was a false narrative that it created for other people. Church planting slowed down. There would be numbers of churches that were planted. Often they would be other people's men. My father was very gracious. Other people would see this and say, hey, that's not right. But my father was very kind and would say, what he was hoping was that someday he would wake up smart. He was hoping that someday he would realize, you know what, I'm not doing what the fellowship does, and would get on track. You're going to put on the screen, Joe Campbell told Pastor Mitchell the all-time classic line. He said, the problem, Pastor Mitchell, it's just not in him. If something is in you and you're making mistakes, that can be corrected. But Joe Campbell said, the problem is the spirit of our fellowship is not in him. Therefore, he's not going to wake up smart. He's never going to come online with him. This man was rebellious. He began speaking against Pastor Mitchell. He began speaking against various things, criticizing the fellowship. He began his strategy, both he and his wife, was to turn people away from the fellowship. He and his wife, they lied through their teeth. One of the lessons I give all through the memorial stones is rebels lie. I was fascinated just last year when I was here in October. Well, we're 15 years down the road since he's gone. Someone came and, you know what he said? Blah, blah. It's like, that is a blatant lie. Things that were untrue. And it was always to paint Pastor Mitchell, the fellowship, or American leadership in a bad light. He was using as a strategy here in Australia when he would talk, his rebellion took the form of nationalism. He would say, you know what we got to do is we have to protect Australia against the day when Pastor Mitchell's gone. All rebels love to mouth, when Pastor Mitchell's gone, the fellowship's going to fall apart. So what we have to do, we have to protect. When Pastor Mitchell's gone, we got to make sure that Australia is not hurt. But it was simply rebellion. There were numerous meetings with this man here, overseas when he'd come to conference, various places. Various confrontations. It became very clear that he was heading for rebellion. And it became very clear to leaders that what he was going to do, he was trying to rally, separate the Aussie fellowship for the day when he could pull away. Now, the struggle for Lisa and I, we're from this church. We had family, we had friends here. The struggle for us is seeing that we had to walk a delicate balance. We couldn't just tell people what we thought. You know what, this guy's they're liars and rebels, because that wouldn't be good for you. If we told people in the church before we had a solution exactly what we thought about him, the problem is they have to still function as Christians. That wouldn't be good for them. And what happens, people who run their mouth too much, someday when there is a change, now they just transfer their suspicion to the new guy. So we had to bite our tongues. We were very cautious about answering questions, about speaking openly, and we didn't do that. But the issue in Australia is that we reached a tipping point. It became clear something had to be done, or we're going to lose the Beachboro Church. We're going to lose the Aussie fellowship. Daryl and Jillian came into the church. They left New Zealand and they came in, and he was shocked to realize at conference the image, the numbers that are sometimes other people. There are other churches here. He said the reality from conference and what the church is normally, there are two very different things. At one point in a conference, it began to dawn on him that things were not right, and he asked Pastor Mitchell a very direct question. He said, "Is this man in right relationship with you?" Because he began to suspect that he was not. Pastor Mitchell gave a cautious answer, but Pastor Elliott picked up, he is not in right relationship with his authority. That is a problem. Began to realize that what this man was doing was wrong. And Pastor Elliott, he mentioned this in passing in his sermon the other night. He decided, I have to make a stand for his children and for future generations. This man called Pastor Elliott one day, and he was mad at another Aussie leader and wanted to remove him. So he was calling other Australians that were considered leaders and trying to rally them to agree so he could kill him with death and get him out of the way. And when he began to pour this out to Pastor Elliott, Daryl asked him, he said, "Do you mind if I call Pastor Mitchell?" And the man paused and said, "Well, that depends on what you're going to tell him." Very revealing of the heart, but it became clear that he would not be viewed favorably if he asked Pastor Mitchell, the leader of the fellowship, the one who has an investment here. So there's a problem. And then Pastor Elliott began to be targeted. So if you're not in agreement, you're marked for death. Began to work, rally people against him in that way. Had a meeting one time in a confrontation about what was going on. And Pastor Elliott told him, he said, if you are not, you're supposed to be under authority. And you're in authority. If you're not under authority, then you have no right to be here, and you should fix this. That was, he said, in my humble opinion, I'm asking you to fix this with Pastor Mitchell. It was during this time that Pastor Elliott called me. And now for the first time, he asked very direct questions about what was going on. And now it was clear we're at a tipping point. I began to tell Pastor Elliott the full picture, exactly what was going on, and began to prepare him and arm him so that he could survive. July conference in Prescott in 2008, Paul Stevens gave Pastor Mitchell a word on Friday night. And he said, Pastor Mitchell, on an international level, in the next 6 months, God is going to sort out some problems that have been troubling you. I'm going to put a picture on the screen. This is from my father's Bible, and he writes the man's name. This is now August of 2008, and down there you probably can't read my father's writing, but he said, Lord, let me see it this year. He was grieved for the Beachboro Church. He was grieved for the different emphasis in Australia. That is August of 2008, and he prayed. God spoke to him something out of his word, but he said, Lord, let me see it this year. Some leaders met with my father in the first few days of December of 2008. Talking about Australia, it was very, very clear that we're at a crisis point and on the edge of losing everything. The advice of leaders was, Pastor Mitchell, you need to remove this man. And my father said, no, if I do, it will make him a martyr. It will cause us greater problems, and began to talk about if God was to sort something out in some way. All of the leaders, they'll put this on the screen, all of the leaders, including myself, told Pastor Mitchell, the only one who can take the church is you. Now, I have Aussie citizenship. I could have come, but I said, if I come, it'll be a bloodbath. It will make the problems much bigger. And then, of course, who's going to help Pastor Mitchell? But we all agreed and said, you need to come and take the church. And this is what my father said. At that time, he said, I'm 80 years old. Nelda, my mother, is 75. He said, I don't think I can do it. And I want to tell you, for the leaders, they're like, wow, that's too bad. But this is very personal for me. This is my family, friends. I was launched from this church. Lisa and I came from here. I was grieved, deeply, deeply grieved over what was going to happen in Australia. This man, meanwhile, was an emotional manipulator. He would often use sympathy. He and his wife would talk about how difficult it was and painful, and Pastor Mitchell is so mean, and they're misunderstood, and all that. They used manipulation, emotional manipulation, to try to get people on board or to turn people to their will. I don't remember what our conversation was about. Something was happening. One day I told Pastor Elliott, when he called me, I said, I predict the next service that he will cry. And Pastor Elliott called me later on. He thought I was a prophet. Sure enough, when the heat was on in service, he was breaking down. His voice was cracking on that. It was to get sympathy instead of fixing it, doing right. In December, the Board of Elders, we have leaders, of area leaders, conference leaders, various ones. But then we have, from that group, we have what we call the Board of Elders. The Board of Elders are very experienced and seasoned leaders. They're the ones who handle conflict resolution on the highest level. There actually have only been probably 5 times that we've ever had to meet in that kind of way. It normally is not necessary. But it was agreed this has to be settled one way or another. So in December of 2008, an official letter was sent to this man. He was summoned. You will come to conference and you will meet and sit before the Board of Elders. This is going to be sorted out once and for all. When he received that, he began to, he had in preparation started trying to schmooze the council to make sure that they would be on his side. People that he had ignored, now all of a sudden they're his best mate and wanted to have coffee and meet with them. He asked one of the council members, Don Rollinson, after a coffee one morning, talking about this. I've been summoned to the Board of Elders and kind of laid out a little bit. And he asked Don Rollinson, where do you stand in this? And Don Rollinson said, if you're not in right relationship with Pastor Mitchell, you have no right to pastor here and you should resign. He said, how do I view it? You are maybe a colonel. Pastor Mitchell is a general. What should you do? You should go to America and submit to Pastor Mitchell and whatever he tells you to do. And so this man told Don Rollinson, okay, then you speak to the council, you guys decide and tell me what I should do. Now, I want to tell you something about rebels. Rebels are filled with pride. They are legends in their own mind. When he said that, I guarantee there is no way on God's green earth that he ever thought their decision would be, you should go. Yeah, he thought he could manipulate them and steamroll them. As Don said, he set his own trap. Because that's what God does. God makes rebels stupid. He set his own trap. So now Don he got the full information. He passed that on to Peter Page, who was also one of the council members, and the other 2 that were on the council. 3 of the council members that when they saw the information, they agreed based on this, he's rebellious. If he's not in right relationship, he needs to go. The 4th one was on holiday, but he was able to get him to come back for a meeting. They're in preparation for that. The night before the meeting, Don said he was sitting alone thinking about this meeting, that they're going to tell him you should resign. And he said, what if he doesn't agree? And Don said, I wonder if I should have a resignation letter ready. So he Googled, got a standard resignation letter, printed it out, and brought it with him. In the meeting, now the 4 council members and the pastor met, and he asked them, what do you guys think that I should do? And he was told, you're not in right relationship with Pastor Mitchell. You should resign. And Don slid the resignation letter over to him, and he said it was like he slapped the man, because I guarantee he never saw that coming. And initially I got to call my wife. Stepped outside, and when he came back in, he said, my wife's fainted. I got to run home. But in actual fact, what he did is he began to call people. Began to call his fans so that they would call the council and pressure them. So the counselor sitting there, nothing is resolved. He drove off to his supposed fainting wife, and calls started coming in attacking the council. How dare you? You got to reverse, we need this man, et cetera, et cetera. But what was interesting is all of them, all 4, one of them is extreme surprise, all 4 of them said, Don said it firmed their resolve. They said, no, what we're doing is the right thing. And so they all did. I told Don Rollinson and Peter Page the other day, I said, we owe you. If I could have more children, I'd be naming them after Don and Peter, even if they're girls. I don't care. Some of you, listen, some of you are saved today. The 4 of them decided, 2 are still in the church. You owe Don Rollinson and Peter Page. God bless you. that they were instrumental, used by God to save the church and the Aussie Fellowship. As it came about, after a day or so came, the man did sign the resignation letter, and he resigned. Don called Pastor Mitchell to tell him this, and put back up on the screen that letter. Dad faxed me that. Again, that he had just said in August, he had prayed, God, let me see it this year. Now December, just a few months later, he said, Greg, God did it. He did it. He resolved it. The council asked Pastor Mitchell to come. They wanted him to come, in particular to the church. Dad asked me. He was now willing. He felt that it was God, but he was very troubled. He said, Greg, I'm not sure that I can. And one of the things that troubled him, he said, in sending money to missionaries and all that, he said, how am I going to send money? My mother is not going to be able, by that time she was starting to fade in her skills and perhaps mental capacity, in age. And he said, how am I going to do that? And I confidently said, Charles Spadaro is going to help you. I had no idea whether Charles Spadaro was going to stay in the church, but by faith, Charles is going to help you. And that is exactly what happened. As Charles was a great blessing when Pastor Mitchell came. This man, after swearing that he was not going to start another church, you'll never believe what he did. That's exactly what he did, is that he started another church in the Morley Rec Center, and initially about 175 people left this church. 6 churches in total out of all the Aussie churches went with him. Put up the next photo here. This is now God speaking to him. My father is going to come in just a couple of weeks. And this is a prayer that God spoke to him out of this, and he made this his prayer, is God, strengthen that which you've brought for us. And he was praying for the Beachboro Church, is God, I need you to strengthen the Beachboro Church. I need you to strengthen the Aussie Fellowship. My parents came in January of 2009, and they spent 6 months pastoring here. Another picture from his Bible, the next one here, is God gave Solomon wisdom, very much understanding, largeness of heart. And down there he says, not human or natural ability, but a gift and a gracing to help God's people. And this is written, now he is in Australia, and he writes that February 27 of 2009. My parents came here, and he instructed, I think it was Ross Hounslow, is please find me a furnished apartment somewhere we can stay. And in the all-time classic is Ross found him housing in Lockridge. That is quite a contrast from basically I'm a millionaire living in Lockridge in a former housing commission flat. And my parents stayed there for 6 months. But God did a miracle. All of us marvel in the 6 months that he was here. It would have taken anybody else years to accomplish. He supernaturally restored the spirit of the church to evangelism. Got some photos from that time. Here is my father pulling the altar call at Heaven's Gates, Hell's Flames, Jerry Fussell in an early revival. The spirit of discipleship was reestablished. No longer was it money, money, money. It was the will of God. We have some photos next. Here is a discipleship class as my father began to hold when he was here. Next, moving on, here is the Macca's Cathedral. Holy Macca's. Right here, and what is that? In Malaga, just down the road, is every morning after prayer would sit, answer questions, work on sermons, and he was putting a spirit back in. It was a miracle what God, in 6 months, it was absolutely supernatural. And in those 6 months, my father was preparing the way for the future for Tom and Janice Payne. God had spoken to them and prepared them to come. And finally, when my parents were leaving, The Tom and Janice Payne came, and we have photos. Of course, this is Tom and Janice. They spent the next 12 years, and what they were doing is reestablishing basic foundations in the Beachboro Church and the Aussie Fellowship. Next photo, street outreaches. This was evangelism. Pastor Payne's heart is evangelism. Next photo, here's park outreach. The previous regime would mouth that park outreaches don't work. Well, apparently they do. And you know that's just an incredible part of the Spirit. Next photo, they restored discipleship, planted churches. That's in Pastor Payne's era. They, in the 12 years, Pastor Payne planted 33 couples out. And that is restoring. In 2021, the Paynes turned the church over to Daryl and Jillian Elliott. They got their photo there. You may recognize them. Might know who they are. Here is them when Pastor Payne is ordaining them, laying hands on them. There, I'm laying hands on them in the first conference when I was able to come after COVID. And I want to tell you the joy that is in my heart. You have no idea, from the grief that Lisa and I, the trauma that we suffered for years seeing what was happening in Australia, to come back and to feel what we felt in conference this week is an absolute joy. And we, last year, October, next photo, we celebrated the 45th anniversary of the church. Russell and Sue, the originals from Teddington Street, helping us to cut the cake. But I want to tell you that Australia is in good hands. I told Lisa recently, Pastor Elliott calls me and tells me, informs me or asks my advice on various things. He called and talked about a tricky situation, and he tells me how he handled it. When I got off the phone, I told Lisa, I said, Lisa, I have peace. When Pastor Elliott tells me the wisdom, many times when he's talking, it's like, excellent. That's exactly how I would have handled it if I was here. I have peace for Australia, and I am rejoicing in what God is doing. We need to thank God for the miracle. God, I thank you for preserving, Lord God. Thank you, Jesus. Let's talk finally about succession as we close. What's interesting is that this man who was a rebel, he often lied and targeted me, which was interesting. But God uses foolish people to accelerate his plan. God used that man's rebellion to supernaturally accelerate the plan of succession in the fellowship. So what happened is Pastor Mitchell had to be here for 6 months. So Perth is 15 hours ahead. It's not easy for people to quickly call Pastor Mitchell. The time may be wrong. When my father left, I took over all aspects of pastoring the Prescott Church. All decision making, it fell to me. And it was very healthy for the Prescott Church because they saw Pastor Mitchell's gone, the church did not fall apart. It continued on just in the same spirit that he had put in us. In a wider sense, pastors who normally would have called Pastor Mitchell for advice with their tricky situations, now you could either wait 15 hours or they could ask Greg. So they called me. I gave advice, and when they took my advice and it worked out well, that actually was very, very helpful in many ways. So God used rebellion to actually further the will of God in the fellowship. Here's on the screen, this is something my dad said many, many times. When I left for Australia, I handed the reins to Greg and I never took them back. When he came back to Prescott, I was able to make my father's final years enjoyable. He traveled, he preached without pressure and responsibility. When problems were brought to Pastor Mitchell, he would say, talk to Greg. People said, we need counseling. He said, talk to Greg. Decisions had to be made, talk to Greg. And so I'm very glad I feel in some way Lisa and I were able to lengthen his life because he was able to function from 2009 until 2020 without pressure. And he enjoyed those final years. He let it be known finally in leadership that I was his choice of successor. I had said on Monday night, previous to this time frame, leadership, when I first I said it will never happen, then I began to see it's going to happen, but I didn't have the full equipping. Out of the Aussie Rebellion in 2009, I began to be fully equipped. It was a supernatural acceleration that happened. So finally, in a leadership seminar, my father said plainly, he did a lesson on succession, and in response to a question, he said, Greg is my choice of successor. My mother passed away in 2016. We were able to help my father through, that's a difficult phase of life, and we were able to help him through the next phase of life to the end. I had a plan for a building that would house conference. Some of you in years gone by, we used to meet in a tent. Tents are great, temporary. They stink when it's cold. They're horrible when it's hot. Basically, they're no fun. And God gave me a plan. We could build a building. What would we do with the extra space? We would block it off with removable panels and whatever. My father put his credibility. It was very expensive. And he put his credibility on that and agreed that that's what we should do. We built the building and we're able to move into that. We got a photo of the building. If you want to see that next one, there we go. That is our building. And the rain, do you hear the angels singing right now? Whoa! That is our building in Prescott. To give you an idea, that is, our whole building is 8,200 square meters. It seats 3,000 people for conference, and we have room for that. One day my father preached in a sermon, and he told a story of General George Patton, who was stepping up to a leadership role in the military. He went to his mentor, General John Pershing, and he asked him to bless him. He was nervous about he said, would you bless me? And he said, kneel down, Georgie. And this general laid hands on him and conferred a blessing for the task that he had. When I heard that, I approached my father after breakfast and I said, I need that. And I asked him, would you pray for me? I need you to impart your blessing for leadership because I desperately need your spirit. I desperately need wisdom. He did that privately. Another rebel, there are always rebels. You got to learn this in time. Another rebel, coincidentally from Australia, rose up again, and he was mouthing the same line, the fellowship's going to fall apart when Pastor Mitchell dies. He ticked my father off. And so my father preached a sermon in conference. You probably can find it on YouTube. Not now, I would prefer, but it was called When Pastor Mitchell is Gone. And at the end of that, in the end of church planting, show a photo here, he called Lisa and I up. If they'll put the photo up, it's beautiful. Oh, there it is, okay. And he publicly laid hands and was telling the world that this is my choice of a successor, but what he was doing was imparting that spirit. He'd already done this privately, but now he did this publicly. My father preached his last conference here in March of 2020. He was already had dementia, was already struggling, was able to get through it, came home, preached one more place, and then he was done. And preached his last sermon in April of 2020. And then we finally had to care for him the last months of his life. He passed away September 21 of the year 2020. I've showed this before, but the headstone, this is what I put. My father had left his headstone blank. What he wanted to say, Dad? And he said, you choose. That was everything falls on me. How do you sum up a life? And that's what I chose for my parents. Simply, they blessed the world. And that's what my parents did. They literally blessed the world all over, and especially Australia, that was on his heart, that he loved. I'm often introduced, Pastor Elliott introduced me as the leader of the fellowship. People say that. I do think that people have a wrong idea about what that means. I think they think being the leader is a position of power. I don't know what they imagine, like I have banks of phones and I'm answering yes, no, off with their head, you know. It's a power position. That is not, and I put on the screen, Being a leader is not a position of power, it's a place of service. That's my job. When you say he's the leader of the fellowship, it means I get to serve the fellowship. My job is to serve the fellowship and the churches. What do I do as leader? It is my job to maintain the course, to hold to the vision, to never turn away from what has been given to us. It's my job to impart a spirit. That's what everywhere I go. When I'm here at conference, I was up meeting with pastors 6 every morning at 6 in the morning, answering questions. I am imparting a spirit. That's my job. It's my job to give reference points in teaching. This Memorial Stones and many other of my Sunday schools are used. They're giving reference points in doctrine and teaching. It's my job to provide advice and counsel on difficult situations. It's my job to direct financial resources for God's purposes. My job is to foresee dangers, whether they are doctrinal dangers or sidetrack issues, to make sure that we avoid them and deal with them. I direct leaders in how to deal with conflicts. I have to get involved in many, many conflicts. So that's what it means that I am the leader of the fellowship, which is why everywhere I go, I ask you, I beg you, pray for us. Pray for me. I need wisdom. If you will pray for Lisa and I, you're helping yourself. Because if God gives me the wisdom in difficult situations, it is my aim before God that we stay on the course that my Father gave us all and never turn away until Jesus comes back. Moving into the future, quickly before we close, God has done an amazing work so far, but we're not finished yet. Joshua 13:1, someone wants to read this off the screen.
Now Joshua was old, advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, "You are old, advanced in years, and there remains much land yet to be possessed."
Okay, there remains very much land, some translations say, yet to be possessed. There are 235 nations in the world, and this, of course, is old because superseded by this conference. We have churches, the screen will say 142 nations, but we planted in Seychelles, so now it's 143 nations. But what that means, next screen, is that, this is an old slide, this is February of 2024, 93, now in the Seychelles, there are still 92 nations in the world that we have no fellowship church in. There remains very much land to be possessed. Many of the nations to go, they are Muslim. We need strategies. We need open doors. We need the right people for those nations. Many people ask me, what do you see for the future? I want to tell you what I see and what I'm believing for. I am believing for a last days revival. That's what I see in the future. Yes, there are winds of war and conflict and politics and craziness. Yes, I get it. But I'm believing for revival. Amos 9:13.
Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him who sows seed. The mountains shall drip with sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it.
Okay, this is a prophecy, I believe, of the future. What it is saying, there will come a time. The plowman, normally it's in the spring, you're getting ready to prepare the ground, but there was such a massive harvest, they're still pulling in the harvest when it's time to get ready for the next one. I believe that is describing, we are going to see an absolute supernatural reaping of souls. And this is why we're planting churches all over the world, to be in position to retain the fruit that God gives. Finally, in closing, how can we stay on track over time? How can we make sure that we don't deviate? And I believe one of this is by what the Bible calls, it's the title of my series, Memorial Stones. Memorial stones form patterns of blessing and safety. Exodus 25:40.
And see to it that you make them according to the pattern which was shown you on the mountain.
Pattern. That is how we stay on track. It baffles me when I see people that they're excited by what Hillsong or some other fellowship is doing. Oh, isn't that? I don't care what they're doing. We have a pattern. It works, and it works fantastically. We're called to do that. I encourage pastors to ask questions. You need to understand it for yourself. You need to preserve your own history, and you need to tell your own part, how we got here. where your church fits in the memorial stones. Next slide here, if they'll show it. These are some of the lessons that we've learned in the series, and they're quickly, you're not going to be able to read those. There were a ton of them. You have to watch them all for yourself. But many, many lessons. Those are things that we can go back to, and we can make sure that we stay on track over time. That's all the time we have. God bless you. And the service will start at 10:30.